Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name is Robert. I'll be your host. This is Renoir and Impressionism at the Art Institute of Chicago, our live stream program. We're going to get started in just a few seconds. Okay, thanks for joining us. Let's go ahead and get underway. We always welcome people to introduce themselves. So if you haven't done so already, you are welcome to tell us your first name, where you're connecting from, and if you've ever been to the Art Institute of Chicago. You can tell us that either in the chat or the Q&A functions in Zoom, or if you're watching on Facebook Live, you can type in the comments. It's always fascinating to know where people are joining us from. In fact, if you wouldn't mind, I have a quick poll question. I'm curious to know how many of you have ever been to the Art Institute of Chicago before. If you are a speaker, it's always helpful to know a little bit about your audience. And so I'll leave this open for a few seconds, let all of you respond, and then I'll share the results with you. Let's see, so far we have 67% of the audience has voted, and it looks like we have a very well-traveled group today. I will share the results with you in just a second. Okay, we have 76%. I think we have a quorum. I'll share the results. So it looks like 41% of you, at least of those on Zoom, have been to the Art Institute of Chicago before. That's awesome. If you are watching this presentation, you've been there before. Hopefully you'll see some new things or perhaps learn about some of the stuff you've previously seen. And for the 59% of you that haven't been there, hopefully this will give you opportunity on what you can expect when you go to see the museum in person. I'm going to stop sharing the poll results in Zoom. If for some reason they still show up on your screen, you can hit the X button and make those go away or minimize it or drag it down to the bottom of the screen. And we don't have time to do a Zoom demonstration, but just a couple things real quick that sometimes people want to know how to do. If you want to raise or lower the volume on your session, you can check the settings locally on your own device. We did a sound test earlier. Everything seems to be working fine. Everyone will be in listen only mode except for myself. So if you start cheering during the art presentation, no worries, no one will be able to hear you except yourself. If you want to adjust the screen display so that the slides that we're going to be showing take up the full screen, if that's not currently happening in Zoom, look for something called either view or view options. It's usually up at the top of your session, and you can check off something called the side-by-side mode. If you have any questions, comments, technical problems, et cetera, you can let us know in the Q&A feature in Zoom or in the comments section if you're watching on Facebook Live. So thanks for joining us. Let's go ahead and get started. And once again, just to make sure everyone's in the right place, this is the Renoir and Impressionism presentation at the Art Institute of Chicago. So for those of you not familiar with us, we're Washington, D.C. History and Culture. We're a nonprofit community organization. And a long time ago, before COVID, we used to do all of these in-person programs throughout the DC area, including tours of museums and walks through the cities. And we'd go to film screenings and concerts, and we have a history book club, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, all that's been on hold. In fact, it was a little over a year ago that we had our last in-person program. It was at the National Gallery of Art. It was on Sunday afternoon, March 8th. And I don't know if any of you on the call today were there. It was a presentation on Georgia O'Keeffe, Edward Hopper, and modern art at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And that was our last in-person program, and pretty remarkable to think that that was over a year ago. But since that time, we've started doing these online presentations, which will continue to do so even after the country opens back up again, which it will do so, it sounds like, in the somewhat near future. These programs that we've recorded, not all of them, but many of them, including this one, are on our Facebook page and then also our YouTube page. So if you want to check out more things about art, you can visit us or subscribe to us on YouTube. And the name, again, of our organization is Washington, D.C. History and Culture. I think on our YouTube page, we have 2 programs on Monet, 3 other ones on Renoir. We have Shakespeare in London and just all different kinds of stuff. So you can go check that out. For those of you I haven't met before, my name is Robert Kelleman, and I'm the founder and the director of the Washington, D.C. History and Culture Organization. So let's go off to Chicago, one of my favorite cities. Just a little bit about myself. I grew up in Detroit, which is about a 4-hour drive from Chicago, and visited there frequently. And in college, I was an art history major at the University of Michigan, and I spent the first 2 years of my career at the Detroit Institute of Arts, which is my sentimental favorite art museum. But I've spent numerous days and nights and weeks in Chicago, either for work or just for pleasure, one of my favorite cities, and just an incredible art collection there in the Art Institute of Chicago. Here's some vintage travel posters, and they have the lion outside of the Art Institute of Chicago prominently displayed. And here is the lion. And for those of you who have not been to the museum before, the 59% of you that haven't been able to get there yet, it's extremely highly rated. So this is TripAdvisor, a website that I like, where people go out and rate things to see and do. And according to the folks on TripAdvisor, the Art Institute of Chicago is the #1 thing to see in Chicago. It's got a 5-star rating, which is incredible. So over 24,000 people have cast votes for the Art Institute of Chicago. If you go over to Google, Facebook, Yelp, they also think very highly of the Art Institute of Chicago. So just to give you a sense, I'm sure it's somewhat of a household name as far as museums go, but some people might not be aware of how impressive the collection there is. And what do they have inside? Well, we're going to be talking about Renoir and Impressionism, but just to give you kind of a sneak preview of what are some of the other things they have on display there, let's do this. If we were doing an in-person museum tour, kind of this is the part where we would be walking from the meeting point to the Impressionism gallery. So just to give you a sense of kind of some of the other things that they have on display. And we'll do presentations about some of these other topics in the future. Rembrandt, Picasso, Chagall, Remington, Mary Cassatt. We're not going to talk about Mary Cassatt today because we cover her in our American art tour of the Art Institute of Chicago. American Gothic, Edward Hopper's Nighthawks, etc., etc. So just an incredible art collection there in Chicago. George O'Keeffe. But today, we're going to focus on Renoir and Impressionism. We'll go talk about those other things that we just saw on a later date. And in particular, we want to talk about Renoir. And why would we do that? Well, because 2 reasons. Number 1, he's a great artist. And number 2, it was his 180th birthday last month on February 25th. 1841. So if you haven't done so already, make sure you have a piece of birthday cake at some point in time and honor our good friend Renoir and his 180th birthday. Now, in my opinion, there's really 4 art museums that have an Impressionism collection that are above all the other museums in the United States. Now, I've been to a lot of museums outside the United States, but since I'm an American and our organization is based in Washington, D.C., I'm most familiar with the museums in the United States. And these are the 4, in my opinion, that have an Impressionism collection that's kind of head and shoulders above all the other ones. That would be the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., the Met in New York, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and the Art Institute of Chicago. And so we are visiting the Chicago location today. And just to go back, so what we're going to do today is, this is a presentation on Impressionism. About the first third of the presentation is going to be on other artists besides Renoir. So we're going to talk about Manet, Monet, Degas. And then the kind of middle third will be about Renoir. And then the final third will be about other artists after Renoir, so like Van Gogh. So again, it's kind of a 3-part program. The first part's Manet, Monet, Degas, and some others. The middle third is Renoir himself. He gets the bulk of the attention since it's his birthday. And then the final third will be on Van Gogh and some others. So let's go ahead and dive in. Let's talk about Manet. And what we're going to do is, For the most part, I like to do these presentations in chronological order. So we're going to talk about some of the artists that were prominent before Renoir dived into Impressionism. And first, we'll begin with Manet. And I picked two paintings of his that are very traditional in style. One of the things we want to do today when people have left this program is to make sure they kind of understand a little bit about Impressionism and what's it all about and why is it so different than the art that came before it. So let's do that. Let's look at two paintings by Manet that he made before he was influenced and involved in Impressionist style. This is a very classical or traditional painting. This is a beggar with some oysters. This is from 1865 to 1867. If you need some historical context, in the United States, the American Civil War ended in 1865, of course. Here is another painting that was done around the same time, beggar with a duffel coat. And if you look at these two paintings side by side, again, these are very classical or traditional paintings. These were done before Impressionism came along, and it has a very dark background. The figures are centered in the painting. There's not a lot of personal kind of interpretation in this. He's basically just trying to depict these two people. Photography had been around, but it wasn't quite as popular as it was become later. And so the goal for art at this point in time, when Manet makes these paintings, is to depict these people as realistic as possible. And you can see he's done a really good job of that. I mean, these don't look quite like photographs, but they do look like very realistic depictions of these two individuals. So contrast these two early Manet paintings that are kind of in a very traditional style with this painting, which is in the Impressionist style. And you can see, wow, look at how different that is compared to the other one. So this is one of the most well-known Impressionist paintings. And it just happens to be at the Art Institute Chicago. And again, this has this great contrast between these earlier works and then this one. So look at that. So you have 1865, 1867, and then Impressionism comes along in the 1870s. So this is a little bit later on down the road from the early days of Impressionism. It's done in 1881. But what is Impressionism? Well, you can just kind of look at this slide and figure it out if you didn't really even know much about art. Just the use of color, the fact that it's depicting an urban scene, the kind of modern life in Paris. And then the brushstrokes and the light and the colors and all that stuff versus the very kind of centralized realistic depiction of the other two individuals. So let's go talk about this painting. It's called Woman Reading. Again, it's one of the most iconic, well-known Impressionist painting, and Manet is depicting modern life in Paris. You have this young lady, she's sitting outdoors at a cafe, reading a menu, it looks like, or is she really? We'll talk about what exactly she may be doing in just a little bit. And I didn't do it for all the paintings, but for some of them, I included the card information just to kind of give you a sense of kind of what's going on. Since this is a well-known painting, let's talk about this one. During the late 19th century, Parisian cafes were the gathering places of artists and writers and were ideal locations for observing the urban scene. Woman Reading is one of the most impressionist of Manet's images. The quick, free brushstrokes and light colors are characteristic of his technique late in his career. Painted only a few years before his death, this work admirably captures a fleeting moment, the sense of modern life that Manet and his contemporaries sought to represent. Manet, like a film director, used costumes, props, and sets to create images of modern life. This outdoor scene was actually painted indoors inside Manet's studio. The background is actually his the watering can painting of 1880. So a couple things going on here. Number one is, again, he's trying to depict the urban scene in Paris. And while that may not seem like that big of a deal now, this woman could be hanging out at Starbucks today. In the mid 1800s, this kind of growing middle class, people spending time in cafes was somewhat relatively a new idea. People from 100 or 200 years earlier wouldn't have been doing that, particularly women by themselves. The social norms before the mid 1800s And even to some extent after the mid 1800s, is women would not go out in public by themselves to go sit in a cafe or a restaurant. Even in the United States, that was something that was frowned upon in cult, and let's say around the 1940s. So he's depicting modern life because this woman wants to go do that. And then also too, the fact that this is a cafe scene, but it's not really depicted, or wasn't really done in a cafe. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Here's a close-up. If you want to make the slides full screen and you see my name, preventing that from happening in Zoom, you have to click on something called either view or view options at the top of your Zoom session, and then click off the side-by-side mode. We'll take care of that. And let's see, Eva has a good question. Did they go to cafes in order to be seen? Yes, kind of just like today. You would go there to get some food or something to drink, or perhaps see friends, and then also to meet people potentially. So yeah, good question, Eva. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to type those in the chat or the Q&A in Zoom or the comments in Facebook. So the image on the left is a full view of the painting, and then on the right, I blew up the bottom section so you can see she's wearing gloves while she's holding the menu, and then she has, it looks like a glass mug, perhaps holds a nice tasty beverage in it. So this looks like a spring type of scene because you can see greenery in the background, but yet she's wearing gloves and a hat and whatnot. So perhaps it's even kind of like this time of year if you're in Washington, D.C., that time of year where it's starting to turn green, but yet still can be a little bit chilly out. Now, they were talking about this in the caption. So this looks like this was done outdoors at a cafe, but in fact, it was done in Manet's studio. And the reason why we know that is because the background is actually one of his other paintings. And so if you look, that blue section that I've highlighted, that's actually a watering can that's in this other painting, which is over on the right. And then you can see like the trees and the foliage and stuff. So what he did was Manet had like props and stuff in his studio, like a number of artists would do. And he basically has this woman come in, sit down at the chair, and then have her sit in front of the painting, and then he's going to use the painting as the backdrop. So even though this is a really cool painting, it's one of the most well-known Impressionist paintings, this woman outdoors at a cafe, I hate to break it to you, but she was actually painted in Manet's studio, sitting in front of one of his other paintings. So I hope that doesn't burst your bubble. Sometimes if you know stuff about art, it can be that can happen, but still a really cool painting, but kind of interesting. He's kind of like a film director, and he's setting up these different props and whatnot to get the desired effect. And one reason why he would probably do it, make the painting in a studio as opposed to the cafe, is he wouldn't have to worry about the weather. He could take his time, etc., etc. And here's a full view. So again, just want to give you kind of some views of some other Impressionist paintings that are in Chicago besides the Renoirs before we start talking about the birthday guy. And again, that amazing contrast between his earlier works. And you see this with a lot of the Impressionists. Monet, very similar, as is Renoir. Their early works are traditional in style, kind of very academic, and trying to depict things as photography would. And then later on, they go off on this tangent, and they're not as concerned about depicting things as realistically. Let's talk about Degas. He was 7 years older than Renoir. Here is one of his early works. And for our friends that are joining us from London, you may recognize this painting because there's a very similar version of it. So this version is at the Art Institute Chicago. It's done around 1860. So again, a little bit before the Civil War started in the US, just to give you that context. And here's the London version that's at the National Gallery that some of you may have seen before. And here's the two side by side. Now, before Impressionism comes along, one of the characteristics of it is that artists tended to paint a lot of these kind of historical depictions of different things, whether they were stories from the Bible or some historical event that took place. If you go back to the title of this, these are young Spartans that are out exercising. So a historical type, but when Impressionism gets going on, you don't see a lot of history paintings or Greek and Roman type of depictions in the artwork, but this is before Impressionism is invented, and so that's why Degas is choosing to depict this. I always think it's interesting because there's a lot of well-known artworks throughout the world that there's kind of more than one version of it. And sometimes someone will go to a museum and see something and be like, oh, that looks like such and such painting I saw somewhere else, and not realize there's more than one. And so this is a good example. It's actually the two different versions, but this is pre-Impressionism. So let's talk about some of the Impressionism stuff. So Degas is known for making all these paintings of dancers, among other things, and this is one of his most well-known works. It just so happens to be in Chicago. It's the Ballet at the Paris Opera, done in 1877. And a very beautiful painting. One of the things that's noteworthy about Impressionism is also the perspective. So notice how on the bottom of the painting, he has the heads of some of the audience members in it. And then also too, on the right side, there's this portion of the musical instrument that's kind of sticking out. If you were to think about a very like traditional type of pose on this or perspective, you would crop all that out. Or like if you were doing this with a photograph, with like your camera or your phone, you'd probably zoom in so you didn't have the top of the people's heads and the musical instrument, but he's not really concerned about that. So he includes them in there. It does actually add a nice touch because you know what's going on. You can tell because the audience members are there, you know that this is not a practice performance. And here's the depiction for this one. One of 19th century's most innovative artists, Edward Degas, often combined traditional techniques in unorthodox ways, such as this perspective. In Ballet at the Paris Opera, the artist creatively joined the monotype technique, rarely used in his time, with fragile medium of pastel. So this is not always using oil paints. Described, quote, the powder of butterfly wings. Pastel was the perfect medium to illustrate the onstage metamorphosis of spindly young dancers into visions of beauty as perfect and short-lived as butterflies. And so again, that pastel coloring and the kind of comparison between the butterflies and the dancers is an interesting connection. This work bears Degas' characteristically cropped forms, as we were talking about earlier, and odd vantage points, which effectively convey the immediacy of the scene. The view is one from the orchestra pit with the necks of the double basses intruding into the dancer's zone. So again, just really interesting perspective on this, in addition to the fact that it's a really cool painting. Here is the full view. And here's the close-up. I always like, if you haven't been on one of our art programs before, I always like to give you some close-ups because if we were at the museum, it's usually helpful to look at the artwork from kind of far away and close up just to get the different vantage points or perspectives. And this is a noteworthy painting because a lot of the Degas dancing scenes are not actual performances in front of the public. He would often do depictions of dancers that were practicing or rehearsing and doing things like that. But this one, because we can see the audience members, we know that this is an actual performance, which is a little bit unique for him. It's not rare or unusual, but more often than not, his dancer paintings tend to focus on people that are rehearsing or practicing. Here's another well-known of his. Continuing on with the dancing theme, it's called The Star. And who's the star? Well, we can tell that, obviously. It's the young lady on the left. And again, notice the interesting perspective. If we were to take a picture of this, say with our phone or whatnot, we would probably center it on her. But he, even though she's the star and she's the focus of the painting, he kind of has her a little bit off to the top left, more so than a traditional artist would have done. You would think this would have been maybe more kind of a traditional type of perspective. Okay, let's continue on. So an artist I really like that's not always a household name, some people are familiar with her, some not, is Bert Morriso. She was born in 1841. She was actually born about a month before Renoir. And I like the fact that she's been getting a lot more attention recently in different media contexts. They had a big art exhibit centered on her in Philadelphia a couple years ago. And here's a work that she did. This is a watercolor that's in the Chicago collection. So for the most part, most of the paintings and artworks that we're gonna be looking at today are in the Art Institute Chicago. But I will include a few other ones just to kind of give you some comparison point. This is a watercolor that she made called On the Balcony from 1871 or 1872. And a lot of people kind of compare her work to Mary Cassatt, or can potentially get her mixed up with Mary Cassatt and vice versa. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk about Mary Cassatt, but we do that in our American art presentation at the Art Institute Chicago. So if you want to learn more about her, you can come back for that. Here is a well-known work of hers that's in Chicago. It's called Women at Her Toilet, or Bath is kind of the American English translation of that word. And this is an interesting one because what's happened here is this is another depiction of modern city life in Paris. And so this woman has gone out for the evening, perhaps to a ball or to some type of social function, and she's returned home, and it looks like she's getting ready for bed. And it's an interesting painting because some of the details we can kind of tell what's going on, but yet some of it's kind of left to our imagination. We're not quite sure all the details, so she leaves it up to us to fill in the story. And I like her artwork. The coloring of it is very distinctive, very luminous, and she frequently uses these kind of whitish silvery grays type of tones, in addition to kind of adding on other colors to that. So this woman is sitting at her mirror, and we can't really tell, is she basically sitting here kind of thinking about the terrible time that she had that evening, or perhaps she's sitting there thinking about, wow, what a great time I had. Maybe she met someone that's captured her attention. We can tell it's the end of the evening because she's taken the flower off of her dress and put it on the table that's next to her. So again, part of the details of this painting are stated, but yet some of it's left up to our imagination, kind of like a good movie where we have to fill in some of the details. And again, she's an artist that's been getting a lot more attention recently. All the Impressionist artists were not male. There were several female Impressionists, and I really like her artwork a lot. I have for a long time, and it's great to see her getting more attention. You can see that's kind of a similar type of depiction, just from the opposite perspective. Consistent with the Impressionist aesthetic that Bert Morriso fervently espoused, this painting attempts to capture the essence of modern life, rendered with soft, feathery brushstrokes in nuanced shades of lavender, pink, blue, white, and gray, the composition orchestrated with brushed blonde hair, satins, powder puffs, and flower petals. She was a close friend and frequent model for Manet, and she married his younger brother, Eugene, the year before she completed this painting. So Morriso was related to Manet through marriage to his younger brother. So that's a pretty cool connection. And they greatly admired each other's artwork and spent time sometimes painting together and helping one another. In addition to domestic interiors such as this one, Morriso's pictorial realm included studies of women, children, and gardens. Here's a close-up. And again, just think, it seems like she's come home for the evening because she's taken the flower off of her dress. She's put it on the table. She's in kind of more of like a relaxed mode as opposed to someone like hurriedly trying to get ready to go out. And then it looks like it's the moment where she's getting ready to let her hair down. So that's why they think that she's come home as opposed to getting ready to go out for the night. Okay, let's talk about Monet. And he was very good friends with Renoir. They were only 3 months apart in age, and they were very, very close, almost like brothers. If you go to Chicago, they have 33 Monet paintings, so an amazing collection there. Unfortunately, due to time limitations, we can't go through all 33, but I have picked a handful of them. This is one of his most well-known works. It's the arrival of the Normandy train traveling back and forth between Paris and Normandy. And the Impressionists are really fascinated by modern life. And this is a great example. We might kind of take for granted trains, but in 1877, trains were somewhat still a new phenomenon. They had been around for a few decades, but they really, by this point in time, are kind of starting to become really integrated in with daily life, particularly in the cities. And Monet is captivated by trains, and there's numerous dozens and dozens of paintings that Monet did that have some type of train theme in them. And this particular series was one that he painted over and over again. This is actually my favorite of the Normandy or the train series that he did, perhaps because it's in Chicago and I got so familiar with seeing it. Here's the full view. And Monet's really interested in light and depicting a light at a specific moment in time. And so this train station would make a great reason to do that, because you have the light shining through the glass shed and then also coming in from the outside, and then the smoke from the train. And it adds an extra element of complexity for him to tackle. Here's a close-up. Now, this is very impressionistic in the sense that he's not trying to make this look like an exact depiction of this train station the way, say, a photographer would. The Impressionists frequently paid tribute to the modern aspects of Paris. Their paintings abound with scenes of grand boulevards and achievements of modern construction, such as iron bridges and trains. Monet chose to focus his attention here on the glass and iron train shed, where he found an appealing combination of artificial and natural effects. The rising steam of locomotives trapped with the structure and daylight penetrating the large glazed section of the roof. Monet's depictions of the train station inaugurated what was to become for him an established pattern of painting a specific motif repeatedly in order to capture subtle and temporal atmospheric changes. So this is something that Monet is known for. He gets kind of an idea for a subject in his head, and then he ends up painting it over and over again. So there's numerous versions of these train station paintings. And the train station is actually a real place that you can go visit in Paris. So you have to decide which one do you like better. You like the real modern version today, or do you like the Monet version? But again, a real place. So he's trying to depict what life is like in the modern city. And that way, kind of almost like a visual journalist, just depicting or documenting what's taking place in Paris at this point in time, which would have been a very exciting time to live there. Let's talk about another painting. This is from 1882 by Monet. This is in the north of France. And one of the characteristics of Monet's painting, he frequently includes water in his artwork, so you should be on the lookout for that. So our two young ladies, and they're on the edge of a cliff. And then if your screen is big enough to see, off in the distance, there's a bunch of sailboats. So this is in the north of France along the English Channel. And amazingly enough, this painting was actually in someone's apartment for the longest time. And so there's a picture of it with the blue kind of box around it. So this particular person's, how did the museum acquire all these paintings? Well, some of them they bought at auction. Quite a few of them were donated to the museum. So you can see this particular Monet painting is funny, because now this painting would probably be worth tens of millions of dollars. But this particular person had so much artwork, it was, it was on the wall with a Renoir painting above it, which we're going to see in just a minute. So if you look at that painting that's above the Monet one, we're actually going to be talking about that one in just a few minutes. So imagine this being where you lived at in the 1920s and 30s. Here's the painting again. And eventually this got donated to the museum. Now you've probably heard of Monet's garden at Giverny. He spent the last 43 years of his life in Giverny. So pretty much the second half of his life. Where's that located at? Well, it's about a third of the way between Paris and the English Channel. You can see on this map, about 50 miles away. And that's also a great place to visit. If you want to learn more about Monet's time in Giverny, one of the programs on our YouTube page or YouTube channel, I did a presentation on Monet's garden. I think it was like last November, when it was Monet's birthday. This is another one of his series of paintings. This was the poppy field, or poplars. This one is called the poppy field. And he did a number of paintings of poppy fields, and they have the poplar trees in them. He also did a number of paintings of that subject as well. And just look at these incredible colors that he's using here to depict this scene. Again, doesn't look anything like a photograph would. Here's a close-up. You can tell the date on these particular paintings because Monet, even though the scene is near Giverny, he had not bought that house yet. He was renting it. And so all these garden paintings that Monet did at Giverny was not done until after he actually purchased the house there and then started expanding the garden. So if you know just a little bit about Monet, you could look at this painting and immediately kind of get a ballpark date of when it was done, because it's in Giverny, but because it's not his garden, it was before he bought the house there. And this is what I'm talking about. So eventually Monet buys the house that he was renting, and he goes about greatly expanding the garden and ends up making dozens and dozens of paintings in the garden. It was a real inspiration point for him. And this also was a series, these water lily paintings. And Monet considered this his masterpiece. Not the painting, the garden. He actually called the garden that he created at Giverny his masterpiece, which is funny because he's so known for being such a great artist. This was done in 1906. Here's the full view. And I just love the beautiful blue coloring in this one. And he's not trying to show you exactly what this water lily scene looks like. He's kind of giving you a perspective of how the light is interacting with the clouds and the water and the trees and the lilies and stuff like that when he does these types of depictions. Claude Monet produced his late masterpieces, the water landscapes, at his home in Giverny between 1897 and his death in 1926. These works have a single timeless motif, water lilies. The focal point of these paintings was the artist's beloved flower garden, which featured a water garden and a smaller pond spanned by a Japanese footbridge. Monet became less and less concerned with conventional pictorial space. By the time he painted water lilies, he had dispensed with horizontal line altogether. In this spatially ambiguous canvas, the artist looked down, focusing solely on the surface of the pond with its cluster of vegetation floating amid the reflection of sky and trees. And this one also was in someone's apartment at one point in time. So imagine having this amazing Monet painting in your bedroom. And I think this is a funny photo because look at, they have this painting, which is now, again, probably worth tens of millions of dollars hanging on the wall. And then look at the bed. It's actually kind of small. It's not even like a queen size bed, to use an American terminology. So just kind of interesting. You would think maybe today, if someone had a painting like this, they'd have this, monstrous bedroom with this gigantic bed and all this kind of crazy stuff going on, but it's kind of very tastefully tucked away in this apartment. You can see there's two other paintings alongside of it, and then there's another one above the dresser. So imagine going to some parties at this person's house. MC pointed out that the beds were smaller because people were smaller back then. That is you're very correct, MC. Thank you. And again, there's the full view of the painting. I'll let you look at that for a second. Now, one of the things that's interesting about Monet is you can almost date his paintings if you just know a little bit, some of the basics about him, just by looking at what's depicted. So the paintings in the top row that I showed earlier, those are kind of like the middle of Monet's career. The ones at the bottom are more the later period. I don't have any early ones to show you at this particular presentation, but they frequently include people. And Monet likes people, but over time, people really get phased out of his artwork. So if I could have showed you some of the early pictures that he did, or early paintings, they frequently have people prominently displayed in them. And then when you get to the kind of the middle years, which is the two examples in the top row of this slide, you can see people in here. On the right hand side, there's the two young ladies walking, and then the sailboats off in the distance, and of course the train station. But notice that people aren't the focus of it. In fact, you don't see their faces. They are an element of the work, but you don't focus on that. And then by the time Monet gets to the later years of his career, you very rarely see any people in them at all. He's just at that point in time focused entirely on nature. So not that he doesn't like people, that's just not what his area of focus is. So one of the things that's interesting about art is if you just kind of know some of the basics, and then you see a painting for the first time that you're not familiar with, if you know some of the kind of contextual history, you can almost kind of guess either the time it was painted, or maybe who painted it, or maybe some of the stories around it behind it. So I'm going to contrast these 4 paintings with some of Renoir's works a little bit later, and you'll get a sense more of what I'm talking about. Hold on for just 1 second. Okay, let's talk about Renoir. Again, it was, if you joined us late, February 25th was Renoir's 180th birthday. Thus, he's the focus of our program today. These are 2 self-portraits that he made. These ones aren't in Chicago. I just wanted to show them to you just so you can get a sense of what he looked like. I'm always telling people at some point in time they're going to have time travel, and I'd be really disappointed if you transported yourself back to 1870s Paris and walked right by Renoir and didn't recognize him. Let's talk about Renoir's early life. This is his parents. These are 2 paintings that also aren't at the Art Institute Chicago. I just wanted to give you some kind of contextual information about his early life. This is a painting of his mom that he made in 1860 as a very young man. He was only 19 years old when he did this work, and his mom was a dressmaker and a seamstress. It's in a private collection. This is at the St. Louis Art Museum, to shout out to anybody in that area. This is his father, and Renoir's father was a tailor. So the fact that Renoir's father's a tailor, his mom is a dressmaker and a seamstress, he has a lot of exposure growing up to clothes and fashion, and that's one of the characteristics of his painting, is a lot of emphasis on style and clothing and fashion. And Renoir, how did he get his start in the art world? Well, he got a job at a ceramic factory, and then over time he ends up getting allowed to actually do some of the painting on the ceramics. So that was kind of his early artistic endeavor, painting ceramics in a factory. And the Art Institute Chicago has a really great collection of Renoir paintings. Most of them, though, are kind of in the middle to later years of his career. They do have some from his early career, but they're not really all that spectacular, in my opinion. That's just giving my personal opinion. This is an example of one of his early works from 1876. This is at a different museum. This is in Paris. It's one of his most well-known paintings. So Renoir is born in 1841. He makes this painting when he's 35. So they do have some paintings from when his 20s and 30s and whatnot. But I'm going to talk about the ones that are from kind of the middle of his career on, because to me, those are the most interesting ones. Now, remember before we were talking about Monet and the fact that later on in his career, he does not really focus on people. But that's not the case for Renoir. These are all 8 Renoir paintings that we're going to be talking about. So again, if you just know a little bit about Impressionism or just art in general, if you see something new or for the first time, you can sometimes kind of guess maybe who the artist was or when it was painted. And this is a great example. So if you had never seen any of these works before, because they're depicting people, if this was like some kind of trivia game or whatnot, if you were to guess Renoir, that would be a pretty good guess. So let's go talk about these 8 works. This is Woman at the Piano. And again, this one Renoir did when he was 34. He had been painting for a number of years at this point in time. I just chose to kind of focus on the works from this point in his life forward, because these are the best one of the collection, so to speak. He's interesting that he often depicts women doing different type of intellectual pursuits, like playing musical instruments such as piano or reading, things like that. Renoir actually was very interested in music himself. He actually early on in his life thought he wanted to be a professional musician, but then he came to the realization he wasn't quite how can I say this, professional musician quality, so to speak, at that level of expertise. So he switched over to painting, which worked out okay for us. And again, he frequently is depicting women playing musical instruments or reading and whatnot like that. So this is a good example of that. If you see someone playing a piano or musical instrument, Renoir would be a good guess for who the artist is. Not entirely, but this was that painting we saw in the apartment earlier. This was a friend of his. So Renoir is really outgoing guy, has a lot of friends that are fellow Impressionists. So he's buddies with this gentleman, Alfred Sisley, who's a somewhat well-known Impressionist painter in his own right. And of course, he was friends with Monet as well, and also Cezanne. Here's a close-up. It's very contemplative. This is an interesting painting, or somewhat unusual, because Renoir doesn't paint a lot of works of individual men. If he frequently focuses on depictions of women, and if men are involved in the Renoir paintings, they're usually interacting with the women as opposed to just being depicted by himself. This one is an exception, though, because Sisley was a friend of his, and so he broke from his traditional form. If you go back to the slide, let me actually go back. Here's the 8 paintings that we're going to initially talk about with Renoir. And again, look, there's only one guy in the 8 paintings, and it just so happens to be a friend of his. So he's focused much more on the depiction of women than men. So that's another characteristic to look for. Let me go back to our starting point. This is the Laundress from 1877 or 1879. This is a somewhat unusual painting for Renoir, because usually when he depicts women, he more often than not has them either doing leisurely activities as opposed to working. So like reading or playing the piano or having a picnic or something like that. He doesn't do a lot of depictions of people actually working, like is the case here. When you contrast maybe that, say, Van Gogh, who he frequently has people digging ditches and picking fruit or whatnot, doing different manual labor type activities. Not so much for Renoir, so this is a little bit unusual in that regard. What is a laundress? Well, it's maybe hard to imagine now, because doing the laundry can be pretty easy. We just throw it in the washing machine. But back in the day, in the 1800s and before, doing laundry was an extremely tedious and time-consuming task. I've read accounts of women, and depending on the size of their family, they could have potentially had to spend a whole entire day each week doing nothing but laundry, because it's a very manual intensive process. So interesting that Renoir is depicting her here. Thank God for the invention of the washer and dryer. This is a pretty well-known painting of his. These are some acrobats at the circus, and the circus at this point in time is another good example of the leisurely life, the modern leisurely life that people in Paris would have. And so you would do things like go to the opera and go see dancers and go to the circus. This has a number of kind of interesting things going on. This painting was made in 1879. And this was a famous circus of the day. The circus actually exists even today, although it has a little bit different name than it did back then. So these are some vintage advertisements for it. And so this was a form of entertainment. Again, you have at this point in time, the middle class has grown. And in Paris, people are looking for something to do with their free time and their extra money that they have left over, as opposed to, say, 100 years before, when people were doing nothing but working all day to kind of survive and get by. And I'll let you read this caption if you want to. It's basically talking about how the fact that there's just a lot going on here with this painting. So what's happened is this is the end of their performance, these 2 young ladies. And the young girl on the left is kind of acknowledging the audience, and her sister on the right, what that is in her arms is a bunch of oranges. So back in the day, oranges were really valuable, and they were a sign of hospitality. So kind of like, this is before refrigeration, and you couldn't easily get fruit from different places throughout the year. And so these oranges were a real luxury, and so people would give these to different performers, kind of maybe like today, instead of like a rose, you give someone an orange. And so the one young lady on the left has scooped up all of the oranges, and then again her sister is acknowledging her. Interestingly enough, Renoir, for whatever reason, he decided to depict these 2 young girls much younger than they really were. They were actually age 14 and 17 when he painted them. But for some reason, he chose to depict them much, much younger. He may be trying to do that because he wants to capture kind of the contrast between their innocence and the circus atmosphere. I'm not sure what your kind of conception or thoughts are about the circus. It kind of has more of like a family type of gathering now. We're back at that point in time. It was maybe not entirely, but I mean, a little bit seedier than it would be now. The circus life in the circus would have been very challenging for people that lived there, including like these 2 young girls. They would have been working at the circus as opposed to, say, going to school. Here's a close-up. And you'll notice in the background, it's hard to see because of the perspective. Again, another painting that has unusual perspective because it's the way it's been cropped and whatnot. But the audience is mostly male, and they're wearing these dark colored clothing that contrasts with kind of the innocence of the young girls, the circus performers. Let's do this. I always like to compare and contrast Impressionist paintings with other works. And when we go to the National Gallery of Art, for say, to do our Impressionist in-person tour, I always make a point of showing people some of the artwork that was painted before Impressionism, because if you just walk straight into the Impressionism galleries and that's all you see, and then you leave, you don't really get a sense of how extraordinarily different it was from the art that came before it. And so this is a good example. This is a well-known French painter by the name of David, and he painted this young lady in either 1791 or 1792. This young lady is sewing with her son alongside of her, and contrast that with a painting from Renoir about a century later, another young woman sewing, and here's the two side by side. So again, over on the left, the painting from 100 years before Impressionism, that artist is focused more on kind of making this look as realistic as possible. And we wouldn't confuse this for a photograph, but the composition and the detail and the lighting and stuff looks kind of somewhat photographic, much more so than the one on the right. And then also too, that kind of emphasis on the different perspective. So notice in the painting on the left, how the woman is front and center. Our eye gravitates towards her. And the one on the right, there's a little bit of kind of visual confusion because we're not quite sure, our eyes probably, gee, do we look at the woman? Do we look at the flowers? Do we look at both? Kind of what's going on. So that's kind of interesting visual technique that Renoir and the other Impressionists did. They don't necessarily center the focal point in the center middle of the painting like was traditionally done. And this is really a great sense of that. So you have two women, they're pretty much doing the same thing. They're both sewing. They both have an object next to them, which is kind of auxiliary, the flowers on the right and the woman's young son on the left, but yet we focus on the two young ladies. So again, two French artists painting the same topic or subject, but 100 years apart. Now here's two paintings, and my question to you is, which one do you like better? So look at these two paintings for a few seconds and see which one you like better. I'll give you 5 seconds to study them. So these are actually the same painting. What happened was Renoir painted the work, and over time, the colors faded, particularly the background, the red color. So the way the painting looks now is on the left. The way that the art curators, historians, and scientists think that it looked is more like the one on the right. And that's always a big, not always, but that's frequently a big challenge in museums in preserving paintings, because oftentimes the paint will fade over time or will turn a different color. And this is a really great example of that happening here. So if you were to see the one on the left and be like, oh, okay, that's a really nice painting. And then like, oh, wow, look at the one on the right. So it's just unfortunate that they don't have the red coloring. And what happened was, I'll go through the scientific story in just a second. This was a portrait that Renoir made. He earned a living for much of his early and middle career as a portrait painter. So prominent people would hire him to do paintings of them. Again, they had photography at this point in time, but it was still particularly wealthy individuals like to have their portraits painted, and Renoir is very good at it. So that's how he would basically make most of his living at this point in time in his life, from doing these painted portraits. And this is from 1883, and let's talk about the conservation project. Here's the two side by side. This was the big news when they worked on this. You can see the headline, Art Institute Chicago's scientific techniques reveal Renoir's true colors. So how did they do that? Well, what happens is this example, this woman here is holding a section of a painting. Now this is just an example, but suppose the painting on the top of this card is the paint that we would see today. And then the section on the bottom is what it really looked like, or what it would have looked like when it was initially painted. And you can see the fading over time. And this is a somewhat common instance in painting that curators have to be concerned about or deal with. Sometimes they choose to restore the painting. Sometimes they decide that it's just too fragile or too expensive and they just leave it the way it is. And here's their curatorial team. And of course, they use all this computer stuff. I remember when I used to work at the Detroit Institute of Arts, I spent the first years of my career there. Going in the conservation lab was really fascinating. And that was back then before they had all this high-tech stuff they have now. So I'm sure it's even more so today. And some museums will let you kind of get a presentation on how they curate the stuff. So for instance, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, they periodically will have like programs where you can go and see their conservation team at work. Here's the two paintings again. Oh, and so what happened was, the reason why they know that the color was much darker was because there was a swath of it around the outside of the painting that for decades had been hid by the frame. And so when they took the frame off, the coloring of the background that was underneath the frame looked exactly like this reddish coloring in the right painting, whereas the rest of the painting looked like, of course, it did on the left. And this is actually a set of two paintings that Renoir did of the same person. Here is her from 1882. This is in a private collection. And this is the Art Institute of Chicago one. So you can see the similarities and see which one you like better. Do you like the outdoor garden scene or the indoor sitting on a couch scene? But again, same young lady, and Renoir was hired to do her portrait. He's a prominent portrait painter. But again, just to go back to the coloring, the reason why they know the red coloring is because when they took the frame off the painting, there was a small swath of it on the outside that had been covered for decades by the frame, and it had this very red, bright, vivid color. But because of the types of paint that Renoir used in this particular example, the colors faded. So just kind of an interesting case study there. There's a close-up. Someone brought up a good point that the chair didn't fade a lot. That was Diana. Thank you, Diana. Yeah, so potentially he would have used a different type of paint for that. So you got to look at these paintings and think, wow, he's using a lot of different colors. So he would have been mixing a lot of different types of paint. So I'm guessing that that's why the chair did not fade as much as the background, because the composition of that particular color of paint that he used was a little bit different. But very good observation. I always really like reading people's questions and comments, because you guys always either ask really interesting things or bring up things that I had never thought of. So thank you. I greatly appreciate that. Let's continue on. This is another portrait that he was commissioned to do. And again, frequently Monet's focused more on doing depictions of women or children, not so much men, but he would do so periodically. Here's a close-up. Look at the beautiful blue eyes. This one, the paint didn't fade, it looks like. So that's really neat. This is actually the artist's son. If you were to look at this, you might think it was a painting of a girl, but at that point in time in history in France and even in the United States, Western Europe, it was not uncommon for boys to have their hair grow really long and wear clothing that would be kind of similar to what a girl might wear. And so he's actually sewing in himself in this painting, but he was known for having this really bright, luxurious, orangish, reddish hair. That's the artist's son. Here's a close-up. Here he is later in life. And if you were with us before we officially began our program today, I was showing a clip from a movie. It was from this 2012 film about Renoir, and we're actually going to live stream the whole entire film in a couple weeks. So if you want to come join us for that, you can find that it's listed on our calendar on Eventbrite and Meetup. We won't be able to stream it on Facebook. We have to do it through Zoom because of copyright concerns. But if you do want to watch it, sign up for it on Meetup or Eventbrite. And again, we're going to stream the whole film. It's a 2012 French film called Renoir that basically details his later life and the relationship he had with his son and this young lady. And again, there's all the people. Now, Renoir doesn't always paint people. He sometimes does some other things. Here's a beautiful painting of some chrysanthemums. Here's a watercolor study that he did of some groves of trees. Renoir frequently experiments in other art forms. So he did watercolors, he did lithographs. Later in his life, he would also do sculptures. This is one I'm guessing that would be hard to guess who the artist was for this. Maybe you might guess Renoir because of the colors and kind of the style, but it's really an unusual painting for him. And let's go back to talking about the people. So these are 3 more Renoir paintings, and these ones are all similar in the sense that they're people depicted, but they have kind of a landscape background to him. He's not doing the thing where Manet did, where he's using the fake background. These actually are real backgrounds in this particular case. And the one on the right is one of the iconic paintings of Impressionism. And it just so happens to be here in Chicago. It's one of their most popular paintings. So let's talk about these 3. Here's the first one. This is called Near the Lake. And again, these 3 are interesting in the sense that it's kind of like a portrait because he's depicting 2 individuals, but yet it's also kind of like a landscape because the portion of it that's further in the background. So kind of interesting kind of combination of these 2 different types of themes. You have this really bright, bold, vivid colors. And again, another depiction of modern life. These are people that are kind of out probably on their day off. This gentleman maybe taking his daughter out for a day out and enjoying themselves. Here is a similar type of thing going on with the people in the background. This is called The Rower's Lunch. You can see the similarities with that. Oh, see, this is what I was talking about earlier. So Nicole just gave me a heads up that an interesting restoration job is Eakin's Gross Clinic in Philadelphia. So thank you. I'm familiar with that painting, but I didn't know about the restoration job. So I have to check that out. So again, really appreciate all your questions and comments. Thank you very much. Just beautiful colors on this. Notice he's smoking a cigarette, got it in his left hand. If you've been to one of these presentations I've done before, I always talk about how important it is when you go to a museum in person to look at the artwork from different perspectives, like from the left or the right, or from close up and far away, because you can really see a lot of different types of things. So this is the full painting. So, say we're looking at this from 5 feet or 10 feet away. And then if you kind of zoomed in and walked in closely and looked at it from like 12 inches away, you usually probably don't want to get closer than 12 inches of you'll make the security guards nervous because these paintings are so valuable, but you can see just the flickers of paint on the canvas here when you look at it closely. So just really interesting to look at the artwork from different perspectives, whether it's close up or from far away. Here's the other one. 3 people chilling out at lunch. So 2 men and a woman, they're boaters, and they're taking a break basically from boating along the Seine River to enjoy a nice lunch. And here's a close-up of this one. So I didn't take these pictures myself. These are actually from the museum, but they're interesting in that, wow, you can look at all the different colors that are going on. So just look even in this one little swath here, how many different shades of blue and green are used. And then, of course, also he puts his name in there, his signature, the Renoir on the bottom. But I just think this picture is interesting because, if you look at the painting from far away, I'm like, oh, yeah, there's blue and green. This actually is the bottom left corner of the painting. So if you're looking at like, oh, yeah, it's got some blues and greens going in. But when you look at in this level of detail, it's like, wow, look at all those different shades just in this one particular section. So really an incredible amount of work would have taken to go into a painting like this to get all these different colors. So really amazing. Here's another close-up section. That's the woman's shoulder on the right side of this painting, that blue color. And again, you can just see the brush strokes there. That's really amazing. And these are the bottles that are on the table. And again, just look at all the different colors that are going on here that you wouldn't necessarily notice if you were looking at the painting from farther away. So that's really cool. But again, I didn't take these last 3 photos myself. These are courtesy of the scientific team at the Art Institute of Chicago. My cell phone's not quite that powerful. In this painting, Renoir shows a group of boaters, 2 oarsmen and a female companion dressed for water in blue flannel, relishing an alfresco lunch. Bottles on a silver tray, fluted wine glasses, and a compote of fruit have been offered for their enjoyment on a brilliant white tablecloth. Judging from the bustle of the boating traffic in the background, this is only one of many such groups that took to the waters of the Seine on a summer day. But Renoir transformed this commonplace scene into an idyllic episode of sensuality and pleasure. Oops. Now, you might be familiar with this painting, especially if you're in Washington, D.C., because this is one of Renoir's most well-known works. This is called Luncheon of the Boating Party. And the reason why I'm showing it to you is because, number one, we're a Washington, D.C.-based organization. Number two, it's a really cool painting. And if you're familiar with Renoir or learning about him, you should know about this painting. It's at the Phillips collection, so a great place to visit. But, and here's a close-up of that. Again, notice the people. And the reason why it's connected to this painting is they're done in the same exact location. So Renoir paints these at a restaurant in France, which I'll show you in just a second. So these 2 scenes done at the same place. And here it is. So this is a postcard of what this place looked like back in the day. And so those last two paintings I showed you, the people were sitting on these awning covered terraces that were overlooking the river. And you can see in the foreground, kind of over on the left, there's a little, not really little, but there's a canoe there with some people inside of it. And so again, this is along the waterway, and kind of a leisurely activity would be to go boating in this particular section. And after you got boating, or when you're taking a break, or when you got done, or maybe even before you start, you'd need something to eat and drink. And so you'd go into this nice restaurant. And it actually still exists today. So I'll let you read that caption on the right if you so choose. So again, if you are looking for something to do, you can go check this place out. Here's where it's located at, west of Paris. Now, it's kind of part of the Parisian sprawl now, but back then, this would have been much more of a rural area. It's closed because of the COVID, the last I checked. But this slide I took a couple months ago, so that things may have changed. Here's another postcard. Again, you can just see all the boats. So how would people spend their free time in Paris at this point in time? Well, you would go boating along the river and then go have a nice lunch. Here's the restaurant today. It's over on the right, the section where the paintings were done. And it's a place you can go check out in person. So it's always cool when there's well-known artwork and you can actually visit the places where these paintings were made. So that's always a neat thing. Here's the bottom level. Here's the restaurant today. Now, the only bad thing about now is there's a couple of bridges that weren't there in Renoir's time. So if you see over kind of on the right side of the photo, there's that green kind of horizontal line that's a bridge. And then if you look across the river, all those buildings weren't there during Renoir's time. It would have been much more like a countryside type of setting. But still a pretty cool place to go check out, especially the historical connections to Renoir and the Impressionists. Another view of today. No, that's not my boat in the center of the photo, but good question. And this painting is also done at the same location. So this same restaurant that where he did those other two, he also did this one, which is a kind of iconic artwork of his, one of his most well-known paintings, one of the most well-known Impressionist paintings in general, one of the most popular artworks at the Art Institute Chicago. It's called Two Sisters, and they're on the terrace of that same restaurant. And this is just an amazing painting. Two Sisters on the Terrace is one of the most popular paintings in the Art Institute Chicago. Now that's really saying something, because if you were with us beginning of the presentation, when I showed you some of the other artwork they have, like American Gothic and Nighthawks and et cetera, there's a lot of great artwork in Chicago. Here Renoir depicted the radiance of lovely young women on a warm and beautiful day. The older girl is posed in the center of the evocative landscape and gazes absently beyond her younger companion. Technically, the painting is a tour de force. Renoir juxtaposed solid, almost life-size figures against a landscape that, like a stage set, seems a realm of pure vision and fantasy. So just really an amazing painting, beautiful colors. This one, I don't want to burst your bubble either, but this actually is not Two Sisters, even though that's the name of the painting. The paintings get their name from a variety of sources, sometimes from the artist, sometimes from the dealer that sold it, sometimes from the person who purchased it, sometimes from the owner, current owner of it. This one was not Two Sisters because they know the young lady on the left, she would actually end up later on becoming a well-known actress, but that's not. She didn't have a sister that age, so they know that this is not Two Sisters, but that name actually came from the dealer who sold this painting. He thought it would be more attractive or more likely to sell if people thought it was Two Sisters, so that's why he ended up calling it that. You know, good enough. Here's a close-up of the younger girl, and just look at those beautiful colors. I mean, wow, that's really amazing. And here's a close-up of the top. So I'm guessing that the 60% of you that haven't been to the museum are going to start planning a trip there when COVID ends. You can check this stuff out in person. But because there's so much great art at the museum, you'd kind of have to make a mental list of which things you want to see, because there's really a lot of artwork to take in the Art Institute Chicago. You can easily spend a full day there. Looking into different things. So one of the good advantages of a presentation like this is you can kind of see some of the highlights so that when you end up making your in-person visit, you can be sure not to miss something like this. Now, again, I remember before we were talking about Monet and the fact that, you know, Monet likes people, but as his career progresses, he focuses less and less on depicting people. And in fact, later in his career, he doesn't really have depictions of people at all in his paintings. He's just focused on doing nature scenes and portraying light. And contrast that with his buddy Renoir, who most of his well-known paintings do have people in them. So that's kind of an interesting compare and contrast between these two great artists that were only separated at birth by 3 months and were really close friends, almost like brothers. So again, the Monet paintings, and again, it's just a sample of 4, but very indicative of his career overall, with these Renoir ones that frequently have people. So again, if you're trying to guess who made a painting that you see for the first time, if it has people in it, Renoir might be a good guess. Okay, let's talk about some other well-known artworks at the museum. So that's the end of the Renoir stuff. Let's talk about some other great Impressionist artwork that's in Chicago, including Van Gogh, who we'll talk about in just a minute. But this is an iconic painting. This is Kelleman. He's not maybe a household name, but this painting is one of the most well-known Impressionist paintings. This is a street scene on a rainy day in Paris. This was done in 1877. You may have perhaps seen this one before. Here's a close-up of it. And one of the great things about seeing the artwork in person is you can tell the size of it. So look at how massive this painting is. And so when you walk in the galleries, you basically turn the corner and enter the Impressionism galleries, and this painting is staring you right in the face. At least it was right before COVID. Now that could have changed, but this really is an attention getter. Here's another view. A lot of the early and A lot of the early Impressionist paintings are not this size because a lot of the artists, like including Renoir and Monet, they were struggling financially. So they didn't have the financial resources to put a composition like this together. This would have taken quite a bit of money to get the canvas, the paint, and then also the frame if you had decided you wanted to have one. Now, this one is a little bit later in the Impressionists. It's from 1877. And he's doing okay financially. But if you look at like a lot of early Monet paintings, they're usually not very large the way this one is, even though this is not a Monet. This complex intersection represents a microcosm of late 19th century Paris in this monumental urban view, which measures almost 7 by 10 feet and is considered the artist's masterpiece. Caillebotte strikingly captured a vast, stark modernity, complete with life-size figures strolling in the foreground and wearing the latest fashion. So imagine that, they're dressed up the way the fancy folk of Paris would have been back in that day, looking very dapper. And another thing, again, it's interesting, a lot of these well-known artworks are real places. So you could actually visit the spot where this painting was made. How about that? So next time you're in Paris, make sure you go check that out. Now, if you do go visit this site, a travel tip for you. Be careful, because I always get nervous seeing these people standing out in the street taking these pictures. So you don't want to get hit by a car. So again, really great place to see. But if you are to take a picture, maybe be very careful or have someone be your wingman to be on the lookout for passing mopeds and cars and buses and whatnot. So anyway, and here's the close-up again. Here is another iconic painting you can go see in Chicago, Georges Seurat. And this is his well-known painting. This is a Sunday afternoon. And if you saw Ferris Bueller's Day Off, they featured this painting in it. This one is interesting that he created not through like traditional brush strokes, but through a bunch of dots. So if you look closely, actually, let me go. If you look closely, depending on the size of your screen, these aren't traditional brush strokes. It's a bunch of series of dots of color that he puts. When he combines that with all the other dots, ends up making this painting. So it's really an interesting and different artistic approach. Let's go back. I'll let you read the captions. So Seurat actually knows several other artists himself, including Van Gogh. We're going to see Van Gogh using kind of like a similar technique for one of his self-portraits in just a minute. But again, this is one of the most iconic Impressionist paintings. Although this is usually more of a considered post-Impressionism or after Impressionism. And it has an influence on modern art in the sense that because Impressionists are trying all these different things, that inspires artists that come after them to also try other things. Artists like Picasso and Georgia O'Keeffe and Jackson Pollock and Andy Warhol, et cetera, et cetera. So the fact that the Impressionists challenge traditional art convention really inspires other artists that came after them to do the same. And speaking of Vincent Van Gogh, let's talk about him. So this is the portrait that I was referring to earlier, self-portrait. And again, you can see kind of a similar type of idea. And he knew Seurat. They were friends. They both met while they were in Paris. They spent actually some time together traveling around and painting some of the same scenes. And so it's pretty cool that this particular portrait looks like it was influenced heavily by Seurat, the use of the dots, which is different than many of the other Van Gogh portraits. And Chicago has 9 Van Gogh paintings, which, if you're in perhaps Europe, 9 might not seem like a really big number, but in the United States, that is a big number. So I'm putting together for a different project. where the Van Gogh paintings are. And this is just strictly the museums in the United States, and this is just strictly oil paintings. So Van Gogh also made quite a few watercolor paintings, but just in terms of oil paintings and where they're at in the United States, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York has 16, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. has 10, and then the Art Institute of Chicago has 9. So again, pretty distinct company there in terms of being able to see 9 Van Gogh paintings all in one place. And the last time I was at the museum, about maybe a year and a half ago, it was really neat because they had all the Van Goghs in one room, along with some other work that was done around the same time. So it's neat to see 9 Van Gogh paintings all in the same room. These are the 6 that he painted that we don't have time to talk about today, unfortunately, but I just want to make sure you're able to see those, what they look like. So we'll talk about these ones at a future date. I was thinking about maybe doing a part 2 type of presentation because there was a lot of artwork that we basically had to skip over, and even quite a few artists, like we didn't have a chance to talk about Cezanne and Pissarro and et cetera, et cetera. So this is Van Gogh's self-portrait from 1887. It's one of 36 self-portraits that Van Gogh made. And again, notice all the dots of color, which is really cool. And just a whole rainbow of colors included here. Vincent looking very serious at us. And I use this slide that I made frequently. So if you haven't seen this before, what I did is I took the 36 self-portraits that Van Gogh made and I put them in chronological order. So he made the one up on the top left first. Then he proceeded to make the ones on the top row from left to right, the one on the second row from left to right, third row left to right, and then fourth row left to right. And he concluded the last one he made was the one in the bottom right corner. And so I made this kind of for a few different reasons. Number one, just so you can see how his style progressed over time. So Van Gogh, early on in his career, he's painting very traditional style and traditional colors. Notice those kind of first 4 or 5 paintings that he did are very dark and serious. And then later on, when he moves to Paris and meets the Impressionists and learns about them, his colors end up changing. They become much lighter and brighter. And then also the Chicago painting is interesting because he does the dot type of technique to a certain degree. So you can see where the Chicago self-portrait fits in with some of the other well-known ones or other ones that he did. In 1886, Vincent van Gogh left his native Holland and settled in Paris, where his beloved brother Theo was a dealer in paintings. Van Gogh created at least 24 self-portraits during his 2-year stay in the energetic French capital. The surface of the painting dances with particles of color, intense greens, blues, reds, and oranges. Dominating this dazzling array of staccato dots and dashes are the artist's deep green eyes and the intensity of their gaze. So the gaze does look pretty intense to me, wouldn't you say? And again, the comparison with the painting also in Chicago made by his friend Seurat is very striking. It's neat that because these paintings have such a close connection that they're both at the same museum. That's a nice touch. Here's a close. There's the close-up. And again, the Impressionists, their influence extends beyond their lifetimes. And so their experimentation with new ideas and new concepts ends up leading other artists like Picasso and George O'Keeffe and et cetera, to follow suit. So one of the other well-known self-portraits by an artist that they have at the Art Institute of Chicago is Warhol. And you can kind of see the comparisons and contrast between these two artworks that were from different decades. About, let's see, 80 years separated these two paintings. And this is a depiction of well-known Van Gogh painting. This is his bedroom. Now, this is actually, it was funny, for a while, there was an Airbnb in Chicago that was set up as Van Gogh's bedroom. It actually, unfortunately, closed a little while ago. But, you know, pretty neat. Instead of staying at the Holiday Inn or the Marriott, you could have gone to Chicago and stayed at the Airbnb Van Gogh's bedroom. So this is kind of just like a 3D visual of what his room would have looked like. Pretty Spartan. So this was in the south of France. Van Gogh was renting a room in a boarding house. And here's the painting in Chicago. So the reason why they had the Airbnb is because Van Gogh's bedroom painting is there in Chicago. However, it's not the only Van Gogh bedroom painting. So some people are surprised to know that this is actually one of 3 paintings. So some people, quite a few people know this because they've seen more than one of these, or they just familiar with it. But I can't tell you how many people I meet that don't realize that there's more than one bedroom painting. And it's fine that they think that, or no harm done, I should say, because they all kind of look similar if you just glance at them briefly. Now, if you kind of put them all up side by side, yeah, you can see the differences. But this series, these paintings look somewhat similar at first glance. When you start studying, you can see that you can notice some kind of subtle differences. So he painted the one at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam first in 1888. And then about a year later, he did 2 other versions. The one in Chicago is in the bottom center, and the one at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris is in the top right. This, again, interesting in the sense, the perspective. So look at how much the floor of the room takes up in the painting. It's like half the painting is the floor, and it's a very steep and slanted flooring. So just a really unusual painting. Most bedroom scenes or most artists would not depict it in that way, but that's what Van Gogh chose to do. Here's the one in Chicago and the one in Paris. Here, I'll do that again. So you have Amsterdam, Chicago, and then Paris. And they're side by side. And because they're at 3 different museums, you usually can't see them all at the same time, but they had an exhibit a while back and they had all 3 of them side by side. So not something you can usually do, but pretty neat to be able to see all 3 of them side by side. And they're not very big paintings. Van Gogh was really struggling financially throughout his career as an artist, and so he tended to make paintings that were kind of either small or mid-size, just because to make a big giant painting like some of the ones we've seen earlier would have taken up a lot of financial resources that he did not have. Vincent van Gogh so highly esteemed his bedroom painting that he made 3 distinct versions. Van Gogh conceived the first bedroom in October 1888, a month after he moved into his yellow house in Arles, France. This moment marked the first time the artist had a home of his own, and he immediately and enthusiastically set about decorating, painting a suite of canvases to fill the walls. Completely exhausted from the effort, he spent 2.5 days in bed and was inspired to create a painting of his bedroom. So he moves down to the south of France from Paris, and he moves into this boarding house, and it doesn't have any artwork on the walls. And so he goes into this frenzy creating paintings to decorate the walls with, and he worked like crazy. And then when he got done, he was so exhausted, he pretty much collapsed for 2.5 days recuperating. And then he, at that point in time, decided to do a painting of his bedroom. As he wrote to his brother Theo, "It amused me enormously doing this bare interior. Although the picture symbolized relaxation and peace to the artist," so this was his place of solitude, "to our eyes, the canvas seems to teem with nervous energy, instability, and turmoil, an effect heightened by the sharply receding perspective." So interesting depiction there. Here is a close-up of the top left side of the painting, just so you can see some of the details. So again, this is where Van Gogh's living. It's just a really basic boarding house, a room that he's renting. Here is the other side. This is the room where he had his ear incident. And again, I always like to contrast and compare the Impressionist work with other artwork. So this was done quite a few years before. This was another Dutch artist. This was in 1836. And the focus of this painting is the person, the clergyman. But it's set in a bedroom scene, and the way the bed in the window is positioned is kind of sort of a little bit similar to the Van Gogh work. So let's look at that. And again, just the comparison and contrast between the two. So if you kind of forget that there's the young clergyman there and just look at the bed and the windows and the floor, notice again how much the flooring it takes up half the painting, and it's really steep. Whereas in the more traditional painting on the left, the floor is just kind of like just added on there just so we can see his feet and whatnot. So just a really interesting kind of comparison and contrast. The one on the left, much more lifelike and realistic. It looks almost photographic to a certain degree. Whereas Van Gogh, he's not focused on making it look like an exact depiction. He's trying to express his emotions or his feelings about the bedroom, and the use of colors and the vantage point and all that stuff kind of add to that sense. So again, two Dutch artists painting a bedroom. And there's about 60 years separate these two paintings. Okay, let's talk about another Van Gogh painting. It's called The Drinkers. And so after Vincent had his ear incident, he checked himself. Well, first he went into a hospital to get physically better from the ear situation, and he recuperates from that. He goes back to painting, and then after a while he decides that he's really struggling mentally, and so he checks himself into a hospital to take care of that, and he would end up spending a year in this hospital. And while he's there, he's not able to initially to travel about outside the hospital as frequently as he would like, and so his brother Theo ends up sending him different like publications and prints of art that Van Gogh makes. And so he ends up doing copies of the artwork at this point in time. And so this is a great example. This is a painting that he made. And I think a lot of people just maybe think that Vincent created this on its own, but in actuality, it's a copy of a print that he had seen and liked. So this is the original. And here's the Van Gogh version. So again, he's hospitalized. He can't go walking around the countryside, at least not initially during his hospital stay. And so to pass the time and to have subject matter, he has his brother Theo send him like magazines and prints and stuff that has art in it, and then he can try his hand at recreating these. Now, he wasn't entirely focused on making an exact depiction. He's kind of taking, to a certain degree, some artistic liberties, kind of maybe like a musician, and they're going to record a song that's previously been done by someone else. They're not trying to make it exactly sound the way that it did before. They're kind of adding their own kind of nuances to it, and that's what he does here. So here's the original, and here's Vincent's version. And this is the 4 age of drinkers. It's kind of basically mocking the fact that some people, alcohol plays an important part of their life. So thus you have the 4 family members, the 4 generations drinking alcohol. And it's really interesting colors he's chosen, and then the lines and et cetera, et cetera. So another amazing painting to see. And here's the full view. So we're getting close to the end of our time together. So just want to remind folks, so we have all these, we're recording this program, and if all goes well, I'll put it on YouTube if you want to watch it again or send it to someone you know, or if you joined us late, you can check it out on YouTube. And then we have all these other history programs, including several other art ones on our YouTube page. It's called Washington, D.C. History and Culture. You can find us there. And then again, we have the Renoir film that we're going to live stream in a couple weeks. Now, if you're watching this program on Facebook, we won't be able to broadcast the film on Facebook just because of copyright issues, but we can show it on Zoom. And so hopefully you can come join us for that. In a couple weeks, I'll send out an invite for that. If you haven't already signed up for that, hopefully we can see you there. And that is the end of our Renoir and Impressionism at the Art Institute Chicago. And again, if you haven't done so already, make sure you have a nice, big, tasty, delicious piece of birthday cake to celebrate Renoir's 180th birthday, which was on February 25th, 1841. So with that, I want to say thank you for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday and your weekend, and I hope to see all you some point in time in the future, either in person at one of these museums or on one of our future live stream programs. So thanks so much for joining us. Have a great rest of your Saturday weekend. Stay safe, and I will see you soon. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye.